be put into lockdown if the coronavirus outbreak escalates under what they've called drastic new measures that the government is considering. Another paper to lead on the COVID-19 virus is The Guardian, which points to the case of a person from Essex who caught the illness despite not having travelled abroad, sparking fears about possible undetected spreading. According to the Financial Times, Italy will fund €3.6 billion to pay for the biggest outbreak of coronavirus in Europe. The Daily Mirror's front page splash is that more than 300 people have been killed by offenders being monitored by private probation firms since the service was part privatised. So here with me tonight, journalist and author Christina Patterson and the editor of Spiked, Brendan O'Neill. And a lot about coronavirus once again on the front pages, as you would imagine. The Daily Telegraph is the one that you've picked out first, and the warning from the Prime Minister that things are likely to get worse before they get better.
Well, I have to say this is very, very frightening, and I'm personally terrified, actually. I know I sound as if I've got it. I haven't. I've got a bad cold. But Boris Johnson has... his knee-jerk response in any situation is to use the word fantastic a lot, as if it's some kind of magic charm that sorts things out. So he says, our fantastic NHS will, make things fine. Even he has now conceded that things will get worse before they get better. But he's kind of strongly implying that they will get better quite quickly. We don't know that. The official view now is that it cannot be contained anymore. So this is a case now of trying to slow down the spread, which might, as we'll see in the next story, lead to very, very drastic measures. But the leap in numbers, and from people who haven't been to any areas where there have been outbreaks, that's really, really alarming.
Two of the new cases in the last couple of days haven't been to the...
Well, that's right, but they have infected, so there are 3 members of a family of one of them who have now been infected. So it just shows how quickly that can spread. But the very fact that they haven't been to a country where there's been an outbreak shows that it's not what we were looking at in terms of contagion. And I have to say, for me, the most worrying piece in this whole article, whole paragraph, is this sentence, which says, Downing Street, the Telegraph has learned that Downing Street and the Department of Health are involved in a row over whether Britain will retain membership of an EU pandemic warning system used to stem the SARS and bird flu outbreak. It is understood Mr. Hancock was told he could not travel to Europe to meet other health ministers and coordinate the response to the coronavirus. This is because of negotiations to do with the EU. Now, if this strongly implies that British lives are being put entirely unnecessarily at risk because Boris Johnson and no doubt Dominic Cummings and David Frost or whoever want to retain a bargaining chip in the negotiations. I'm afraid that, to me, is outrageous. We have to do everything we can. People will die. People are already dying. People will die. They could die in very large numbers as a result of this disease. And really, the British government should be doing every single thing possible to stem the
Okay, and we don't know the explanation, and how important that warning system is. There's not a huge
Well, I imagine it's pretty
there.
important.
Okay, I mean, how do you feel about this, Brendan? Because obviously, Christina was saying that she was worried. The government will want people to be aware, but not to panic, won't they? Do you think they're getting that kind of messaging right at the moment?
I think the balance is pretty good from the government so far, but I do think I disagree with Christina. I think we have to calm down a bit. I mean, coronavirus is very serious, and people have died, which is always a serious situation. And the fact that we've had 13 new cases in the UK, bringing the number to 36. I mean, this is a serious situation. But I do think that panic is the wrong response to this, and there is a danger that panic could make the situation worse. And we do have to bear in mind that coronavirus has a 1% fatality rate, around 1%, 2% fatality
Not
rate,
clear yet.
which
it's
is
too early to say.
But that is higher than standard flu, but far lower than SARS, far lower than Middle East respiratory disease and these other variations of flu that have come up over the past few years. So it's not as serious as those outbreaks. So I do think we need a bit of perspective. And some of the measures that government is talking about, shutting down public gatherings, preventing people from using public transport, or other emergency measures that are being considered and might come into force, I think that would be a mistake at this moment, and I think it would be an overreaction to a disease that is spreading fast around the world, particularly in Europe now, but is not as deadly as many other diseases we've seen over the past
Well,
few years. And
Brendan.
I think there could be a detrimental economic and social impact
There will be,
if we overreact.
No, there will be.
Shall we move on to the Express? I don't want to cut you off, but
Yes.
move on to the Express because that kind of deals with some of these.
This follows on from that. On the Andrew Marr programme this morning, Matt Hancock, I think to be fair, he was asked whether it was possible that, for example, cities could be closed and schools could be closed and so on. In fact, there is a school that's already closed, and he said, yes, all of these things are being considered as measures if it gets more serious. I disagree. Obviously, I disagree that that I'm wrong. Obviously, but the Director General of the WHO, his official advice, and he knows as much about this disease as anyone, is that anybody over the age of 60 should not travel on public transport or in crowded places. Anybody over the age of 60. That means that half of London will be in lockdown because unless you have a private chauffeur, you have to travel on public transport. That I think is very worrying. Now, you're right to say that if we, to use your word, panic, I wouldn't say that the word panic was necessarily appropriate, but if we take the more extreme measures, that absolutely will have an economic and social consequence. And one of the many things I am worried about in relation to this is the economic consequence. And again, we'll move on to that in the next story. But if this is as big of a financial shock as 2008, which many people are saying it is at the moment and could be, that will have huge effects on employment, on businesses. People will lose their jobs. But I think where government needs to be more, it's a difficult thing for government to do, but actually it's a trade-off. Do you try to save lives, in which case you lock down, or do you try to save the economy, in which case you don't lock down? And that's the trade-off. But I think to be honest about that.
But I think the question then emerges of whether it's this disease and the fact of the disease and the fact that it is spreading, whether it's that situation that's having these impacts or whether it's our response to it that is having these impacts. So, for example, if you look at the Financial Times and the front page and the story about Italy, because Italy is in a very, very difficult position at the moment. Its economy has been weak for a very long time, and it now has the worst cases of coronavirus in Europe, and it seems to be getting even worse. So that's an incredibly serious situation. But I find the argument that the problem is this new disease, I find that a problematic argument because it ignores the fact of the vast underlying weaknesses of the Italian economy. There's a really interesting line in this Financial Times piece where they say that the Italian government is going to ask Brussels for its permission to take certain economic measures. And that I'm not just saying throwing this in as a Brexity point, that does raise a very important question about what's happened in Europe over the past 20 or 30 years, which is that countries like Italy, having joined the Eurozone, have lost control over their ability to control all aspects of their economy. And once you cede that control, you do make yourself more susceptible to problems like this because you don't have the control over your economy that you might traditionally have had, and you can't make the decisions you might traditionally have made.
Well, you said you didn't want to turn into Brexit.
No, but I do think there is a danger, I think, that if we talk about coronavirus as this great evil that will cause economic problems or exacerbate economic problems, there's a danger of taking our attention away from what is the real driver of those problems. And I think one of the drivers of those problems at the moment is the possibility that we will overreact to this new flu in a way that will be detrimental.
Do you want to pick up on those points?
I don't know which of those points to pick up on. The key point, look, this is not saying, the point here is that Italy is seeking an extra stimulus because, but we don't know. Of course, there are always complex causes to everything, but whatever, if an economy is facing a slowdown and something catastrophic like this hits it, of course it will have an effect. I don't know why. A disease like coronavirus that spreads so quickly, I mean, I wouldn't use the word evil of it. It's not morally wrong. It's just incredibly infectious. And something that's incredibly infectious, even if it spreads as far and as fast as many experts think it will spread, even if it's only 1 or 2%, we are talking hundreds of thousands of people in this country. Personally, I think it's appropriate to think that that's not a great thing.
Yeah,
I wouldn't use the word evil, but I wouldn't say it was an overreaction to worry about hundreds of thousands of people dying.
But flu kills hundreds of thousands
It doesn't
of people
kill
all the time.
No, that is absolutely wrong. It
No,
does
it's not.
not kill in the same quantities. It is not the same as flu. This is much, much more dangerous than flu.
Standard flu, yeah, this has a higher fatality rate than standard flu, but standard flu kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. My point is not to say we shouldn't take it seriously and not to say we shouldn't take any measures. Of course we should. The point is that you can take good measures, which is to be sensible and to vigilant and to make sure that you take as many security measures as possible. But if you panic the population and if you clamp down too hard, you will spread fear, and fear can be as detrimental to society as disease.
Where do you draw that line, Brendan?
Well, we will have to wait and see. But I think at the moment the government is getting the balance just about right. But I think if they push too far down the panic road, things could get more dangerous.
We should take a break, and we should remember, of course, that we don't know what direction it'll take, do we, at the moment?
Well, we do know that infections are spreading, and we do know that in the short term, at least, it's going to get worse.
Okay, yeah, and some of these measures that are being talked about are the kind of for those worst-case scenarios. Okay, I'm sure there'll be lots more coverage over the next few days, but we must leave it there for the moment and take a break, because coming up after the break, Biden bounces back, but will he win on Super Tuesday? We're going to be talking about that after the break. The Daily Telegraph, but it's just a small story on the front page about a story that's been around a lot this weekend, and this is the Prime Minister backing his Home Secretary.
Yes, so Boris Johnson has expressed confidence in Priti Patel following the whole fallout with Sir Philip Rutman, the permanent secretary at the Home Office, who's resigned in a quite extravagant way and is now going to sue the government for constructive dismissal on the basis that Priti Patel was a bullying presence and created an atmosphere of fear and so on and so forth. I must say that I find the contempt for Priti Patel in some circles, particularly in leftish circles, I find it absolutely fascinating and a bit creepy. There is this kind of visceral dislike of her. She is seen as this kind of slightly vindictive, bullying, crazy figure. And I do think there's a slightly sexist undertone. I think there's a slightly racial undertone to some of these criticisms. But I think one of the problems I think that the woke left in particular has with Priti Patel is that she refuses to play the victim card. She refuses to play the so-called race card. She doesn't go along with those kind of narratives of being the kind of put upon descendant of immigrants who has had a really hard life. Instead, she's very confident. She's very driven. She has a very clear political outlook, which doesn't marry up with the kind of politically correct left-wing outlook, and instead is quite, pro-law and order and quite right-wing and so on. So what I find fascinating about this is the way in which so many on the left are lining up behind a functionary like Philip Rutman against Priti Patel, who they see as this evil force. I think it really speaks to some fascinating divisions in contemporary Britain.
Brendan, how can you sneer at people for their contempt and then use a word like functionary about a very, very distinguished public servant? He has spent, I think, 35 years in public service, serving whichever government has been elected by the British people and doing his job extremely well. My father was a civil servant as well and spent his entire career in public service. And I have to say, when I saw Philip Rutnam's resignation yesterday, my father was a very undemonstrative man, but I think he would have approved of what he did, because Philip could have taken the payoff, and he chose not to because he is very concerned about the behaviour of this particular minister to civil servants in his own department, and this has been observed much more widely. It's surfaced this evening that there was an official complaint at DFID a few years ago. Now, I don't agree with Priti Patel's views. I think she used to be in favour of capital punishment. I think she doesn't look at the evidence on law and order. She claims to be tough on law and order, but the evidence shows that lengthening prison sentences, if anything, increases offending. It doesn't reduce offending. defending. So I think it'd be good if she looked at the evidence. That's not my issue with her. My issue is that if any government minister, it's how you treat people who are below you in the hierarchy. And I'm afraid there's a lot of evidence emerging that she is, either a bully or treats people with contempt.
And we ought to move on because I haven't got very much time, but she obviously says that she's not, and lots of details will no doubt come out if he does go to court, as he's threatening to sue, isn't he? So that may well emerge there. But I think we've got time just to go to one more story, which is about DIY braces. And we're not talking braces to keep trousers up.
No.
No.
Dental braces, I don't even know how that would work, but dentists are warning people not to make their own braces for their teeth, which I think is
Sounds like
incredibly
good
good
advice.
advice. Don't do it.
In Blue Peter days, you just, made everything from sticky back plastic. But maybe they've all got 3D printers at home and they can just log in, Siri, make me a brace.
And this is presumed because it's an expensive thing to get, and people want their teeth straight, and people are actually trying
Well, I
it.
tell you, talk about expensive. Don't get to my age because if you lose a tooth, implants, oh my God, the cost of it. You have to remortgage to have it done.
I think it's too late. I think I have got to your age. Anyway, on that note, we must leave it, but we'll see you again at 11:30. Thank you. So we're joined then by journalist and author Christina Patterson and editor of Spiked, Brendan O'Neill. An awful lot of coverage of COVID-19, coronavirus on the newspapers, and you've picked out a few front pages and some inside pages to look at how the coverage is going. The Times, first of all.
But it's very nice, it's very nice that Boris Johnson has come back from his extended break in his Grace and Favour home to engage with this extremely serious issue because, as George Osborne, Tory former Chancellor, pointed out in the Standard last week, he basically has been absent without leave. He looks as though he's been sleeping on the job.
He would say, obviously, that he's working behind the scenes, although we've seen him in the last couple of days.
Leadership, as someone who's written a biography of Churchill ought to know, leadership is also about being seen to lead. It doesn't really matter what you're doing in your bedroom, your study, your office, with your laptop. What matters is that you are actually being seen to lead the nation, and Boris Johnson has not been doing that. He's now come out and said that the NHS is fantastic, and with his usual cheery smiles, seems to imply that everything is ultimately going to be fine. But this is very serious. The number of cases has doubled overnight, and we've already had one British person die, and we're being told that we've got to the point where it can no longer be contained. So, worst case scenario is that people are saying up to 500,000 deaths, and worst case scenario is not impossible. A number of leading experts have said worst case scenario is actually quite likely.
And as you say, a spike today, I think cases up by around a third in one day, and one Briton has indeed died, not in the country. But as you say, Boris Johnson, I think from one of the other papers, has said this will get worse before it gets better. There is an acknowledgement that things will get worse and plans have to be put into place.
Yeah, and I think that's right. It's right to be vigilant, and it's right to be prepared, and it's right to consider the possibility that the worst case scenario could come to fruition. But I think it's really important that we don't panic, and it's really important that we don't overreact. And very often, responding to these kinds of new diseases or new strains of flu in a way that is panic-ridden or fearful can have really detrimental consequences on everyday life. So we do have to get it into some kind of perspective. So the number of cases in the UK have jumped from 23 to 36. That's quite serious. But at the same time, the fatality rate for this strain of flu is about 1%, which is slightly higher than standard flu, but much, much lower than SARS and other recent outbreaks that we've seen. So we have to be reasonable. And I do think that Matt Hancock, the health secretary, and others in government have been asked about the possibility of extreme measures, and they've said, we may have to shut down public gatherings, we may have to restrict people's ability to travel to certain places, and so on. I think right now that would be a mistake. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is ordinary people are behaving very reasonably in response to this, and they're taking the necessary measures to try to ensure that they don't get this sickness. And I think some people in positions of authority are behaving irresponsibly and are spreading a message of fear as if this is going to be some kind of, plague-like epidemic. All I would say is that a bit of reason and a bit of evidence and a bit of sensibleness will make the situation better than it currently
So,
is.
Brendan, who in authority do you think has given wrong advice about this?
I think the World Health Organization is pushing the panic button a bit too much. I think some of the commentariat in the way in which they're talking about it and some of the newspapers have been slightly irresponsible. I actually think Boris and the government have been pretty steady and level-headed. So I actually disagree with Christina about, you're suggesting that Boris has been a bit too happy-clappy and suggesting that the NHS is fine and it's all going to be great. We don't know if it's going to be great. We don't know if it's going to be fine. But I think that's probably the right approach to go into in relation to a new strain like this, so that you don't freak people out unnecessarily, but instead you say, we're going to be vigilant. It will probably get worse, but we can deal with this.
Is that right, do you think, that the government has to strike a middle line between making the public very aware so they behave responsibly?
Of course they have to strike a middle line. Personally, I wouldn't rush to criticise the Director General of the WHO because the WHO were pretty slow to respond to this virus, and B, I would gently suggest, Brendan, that the Director General of the WHO knows slightly more about coronavirus than you do. So if he says that people over 60 should be very careful about going in crowds and on public transport, personally, I would take that quite seriously. And when you talk about the percentage, we have to look at different age groups. Perhaps if you're your age, the percentage risk is quite low. But for older people, the risk is much, much higher. And if you have a health condition, if you have a cardiovascular disease, or you have diabetes, or any number of other underlying chronic conditions, then your risk is much, much higher. So I think one should take this seriously. Clearly, we're not yet at the point of closing down schools, towns, or anything else. And I hope we don't get to that point. But if it continues to spread at the rate it's currently spreading, I fear we might be at that point quite swiftly. And then the trade-off is then deaths versus social economic damage to the economy. That's a tough trade-off, but that is the trade-off. So you're clearly going for let's have the deaths. I'd rather have the deaths than the damage to the economy. And I would say probably let's minimise the deaths.
I'm imagining you want to come back on that. So I'm just going to bring in The Guardian while you do.
I don't want anyone to die, of course, and I think the fact that people have died in Italy and particularly in China is a terrible tragedy. But I do think we need to get it in perspective. Far more people die from standard flu. Hundreds of thousands of people die from flu every year around the world. People die from diseases. That's what happens. Now, we can mitigate this as much as possible, but I do worry about the impact it's having. I was in Chinatown in London on Friday evening, and it was almost deserted. And there is this sometimes slightly irrational response where not most people, but some people are responding in a way which is, I think, overly fearful, overly separatist, so they're kind of cutting themselves off from crowds and ordinary people. And right now, that is really not the right thing to do, and it sends the wrong message.
And in the Guardian copy here, it talks about Matt Hancock in various interviews that he's done today, talking about shutting down UK cities may become a necessity. And there is a kind of, appears to be a battle plan, if you like, for the worst case scenario. Yeah. And then do you think there does need to be a discussion about what steps you take, because closing schools has an impact on parents looking after them, an impact on the economy, transport shutting down.
Absolutely, but I think also this could escalate very quickly, because if you look at the situation in South Korea with that church that appears to be a cult, where they're now actually planning to prosecute the leader of the church/cult for murder, for not revealing what was going on. Thousands more people have been infected, and there have been a large number of deaths in South Korea. So it does show that if you have anyone with the infection in a big crowd, that can spread very, very quickly.
And one of the problems is highlighted in the headline there, isn't it? That new cases raise fears virus spreading undetected.
Exactly.
Because there are some people who have very
Exactly.
few symptoms.
But that's yes, and that really speaks to the contradiction at the heart of this. So on the one hand, that means it does spread faster and in an undetected way, but it also speaks to the fact that it's not in most people, and I completely agree with Christina about we have to be incredibly vigilant with elderly people in particular. But in most people, it's such a mild illness that they don't even know they've got it. There was a really interesting piece in the American magazine The Atlantic this week, which the headline was basically, "You will probably get coronavirus at some point," but most people won't even know they've had it because the symptoms are incredibly mild. So that's what I mean when I talk about perspective. We have to get it in perspective. Now, that may mean that we have to take precautions, particularly around elderly people and people with underlying health conditions. But I think vigilance is necessary, but to reorganize the whole of society around some kind of Cormac McCarthy-style dystopian vision, that will have a detrimental impact, not just on the economy, but on everyday life, social life, and people's sense of well-being.
But Brendan, you're speaking as if it's a tiny minority, people over 60. There are a lot of people over 60 in this country, and if they come across a healthy 12-year-old who has the virus and doesn't know that, they are very vulnerable. You can't just corral people into separate groups because we don't want some Cormac McCarthy dystopia. You know, you don't get to choose that. If you get infected and you are vulnerable, then, you know, you don't have that choice. So I don't see how that works practically. I just don't see how that works.
I'm going to let you answer. I'm just going to show another paper so that we can see some of the coverage. I don't mean to interrupt your conversation, but there's a double-page spread in the Daily Mail where they're focusing on the Prime Minister being very visible today.
Yeah,
Sorry,
but I think
that's
actually a very useful photograph and spread, because the other thing to bear in mind in relation to all of this is that we shouldn't underestimate human ingenuity and the fact that we have it's well within our capacity to come up with solutions to these problems. And China in particular has taken an incredibly important lead in developing a potential, the beginnings of a vaccine or the beginnings of a cure or the beginnings of a solution, and that's now spread around to medical experts around the world. So I just would like to put the positive case for humanity's ability to deal with outbreaks like this, rather than the depressing case which says we're all going to be doomed.
Well, okay,
That's
let me just say that I interviewed a boy who had lost all 17 members of his family to Ebola. And, you know, frankly, it's hard to put a positive spin on that. Now, thank goodness, it looks as though this is not, you know, clearly the death rate is not as high as Ebola, but one's duty is not to be Pollyanna in this situation. Ebola in Africa has been absolutely devastating for certain communities, and there will be some countries that have the resources to deal with this relatively effectively, and let's hope we're one of them.
But we shouldn't be Pollyanna, but we also shouldn't be too misanthropic in this notion that humanity is
not
doomed.
about being misanthropic.
There's got to be a middle road where we can be sensible and vigilant and also hopeful. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. I've got a feeling Christina wants to say we have to go for a break. That's all right. Anyway, we will, I'm sure, revisit this again very soon. Right now, we will take a break, though. But coming up, Boris Johnson backs his Home Secretary, but will Priti Patel survive the battle in her department? We'll have more about that after the break.
Why are you drawn to this?
I'm hoping to spread the story all about Candyman. The Mirror invites you to summon him. You should say his name. I dare you.
Candyman. Candyman.
Candyman. Candyman.
Don't say that.
Candyman.
I brought him back.
Candyman isn't real!
Something's happening.
Time Achievement. She was being honored with a Golden Bear for her long and successful career. Posed and waved for cameras ahead of receiving a... Oscar winner Helen Mirren has walked the red carpet at the Berlin International Film Festival. The British actress posed and waved for cameras ahead of receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. She was being honored with a Golden Bear for her long and successful career.
And is threatening to collapse.
And Brendan O'Neill. We're turning inside the Daily Mail for the next story, where there's a picture of Priti Patel, who has obviously been in the headlines this weekend, and the news today that Boris Johnson has come out to back his Home Secretary.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting story, the whole collapse of the Home Office in relation to Priti Patel versus the Permanent Secretary, Philip Rutman, who's now resigned and is threatening to sue for constructive dismissal. It's very, very interesting. Christina will completely disagree with me, but I think Sir Philip Rutman has behaved very badly in relation to this. And I think he is symbolic of a civil service that has got slightly too big for its boots. And I think his very extravagant resignation, where he made a public statement and he said there's been bullying atmosphere and he's going to sue the government. It does look to me, and I'm sure it looks to many other people as well, like the unelected part of the government machine trying to undermine the elected part. And I think there's a real problem with that. And in the past, the civil servant who had fallen out with the elected government, which happened many, many times, would usually have just slunk out of the limelight, gone away, and complained about it to his friends over glasses of wine for the rest of his years. But this feels like a very political resignation, and it feels like the kind of thing that Dominic Cummings was actually complaining about a few months ago in his kind of weird advert for Misfits and so on, where he was talking about the kind of sclerotic nature of the civil service and the problematic nature of the civil service and the need to give it a kick up the behind and to transform it. This, I think, speaks to that. And I think, actually, Priti Patel, her views on law and order will chime with the public far more than the kind of functionaries. Christina doesn't like that word, but the permanent presence at the Home Office, I think, are out of touch, and Priti Patel is probably more in touch.
Yeah, I think the word functionaries is obnoxious, actually. And if we're talking unelected officials, then we have one called Dominic Cummings, who appears to be running the country while the part-time executive chairman swans off in his grace and favour homes. Look, I think that Philip Rutman, it's a very, very rare thing for a civil servant to go public in this way. He could have taken the money. He was offered a very generous payoff. He didn't take it because he clearly feels very strongly that his colleagues are being mistreated and, to use the word that's being used, bullied. Now, there's been an official complaint of bullying that has emerged this evening from when Priti Patel was at Difford. And I think he is doing this as an act of public service. Now, I think that essentially, a sign of your character is how you treat people who are lower than you in the food chain. And unfortunately, a picture seems to be emerging of Priti Patel mistreating people who are lower than her in the food chain. And, you know, her colleagues say she's fine. Well, their colleagues are equals. If you swear at people and shout at them,
which is the allegation that he's
making. Which are the allegations, and I think the whole reason he's taking this case to court is because he clearly has documented evidence he thinks will stand up in court, and we'll see that will show his case.
Very quickly,
I think that
should move on. And I should say, of course, Priti Patel says she's done nothing.
Of course,
yeah.
But
in fact, I think if she has sworn at people, and one of the accusations that she came out of her office and said, "Why is everyone so effing useless?" So what? That's not the end of the world. The thing is, what's really interesting is that we
the ministerial
live in a
code
culture.
says...
No, but hold on. We live in a culture which celebrates strong women, feisty women, women who get to the top, women who display similar characteristics to the ones that men traditionally displayed, which I think is a good thing to celebrate. Priti Patel does it, and she's called a bully, nasty woman, and so on. There's a real double standard with this. All she's doing is asserting her democratic authority.
I would respond that way if a man had done that. And by the way, while we're talking bullying, Dominic Cumming is clearly bullying his special advisors. There's a whole track record of this.
Okay.
Look what happened to Sonia Carr.
All right. Well, he's not here to defend
He doesn't
himself
need
on
to
that.
defend himself.
Have we got time to talk about cheap wine?
We need some
Very
of
quick.
this heated
20
discussion.
seconds. Let's give it 20 seconds. Winemakers.
I'm going to whack Brendan over the head with a bottle of cheap wine.
I think you've got about
Talking
10
of
seconds
feisty
left.
women.
I'm being bullied. There's a glut of wine.
You're a misogynist and a sexist.
There's a glut of
Always.
wine in Bordeaux, 70,000 bottles because of Trump's tariffs, and something has to be done with them. I think
And we
they
need
should
to
be
snap
shared
them
out
up. We need to snap
across
them
the
up.
continent to cheer people up.
Okay. On that note, we will leave it. But thank you both very much indeed.